Hey, and welcome to the Most Motion Show, where we are working together to help you get rid of your sporting injuries for good. My name's Sarah Pitts. I'm an injury reversal and prevention specialist working in the UK, but being online and live for you today. So, we're looking at hip flexors today because they are such a big issue for so many people. And a couple of the questions I've got, I'm going to answer those for you now. So if you've got any questions throughout the show, just put them in the comments, or if you want to ask me a question so that you can be featured on a different show, then get your questions to me. You can Facebook message me, or you can send me an email at sarah@mostmotion.com. So the first question is from Paula, and she wants to know, why do I place so much emphasis on lengthening hip flexors? Well, that's pretty simple. Hip flexors are involved in pretty much everything we do, and as a Western society we sit down so much. We sit down to watch TV, we sit down to work, we sit down to cycle, we sit down to drive, but because we call all of these activities different things, we think that we're doing something different throughout our day when actually we're just sitting down all the time. The hip flexors get very short when we're sitting, so I'm in this position now, I'm kneeling down. My hip flexors are very short, and that has the impact of tilting the pelvis forwards so that my hamstrings feel very tight because they're pulled very long. And a big mistake that people make is focusing on the tightness of the hamstring and trying to lengthen that. But if I show you by standing up, okay, so if my pelvis is tilted forwards, so this is neutral, my hip flexors are a certain length, my hamstrings are a certain length. But if I tilt my pelvis forwards, you can see my hamstrings lengthen here and my hip flexors are shortening in here. Okay, if I continue to lengthen my hamstrings rather than my hip flexors, and I'm going to tilt further into this position. If I move my arm, you can see that my body doesn't want me to walk around like this because I'll be looking at the floor. So then I tend to arch my back, getting a very big dip in my back here to try and straighten up. Now, if my body doesn't do that, so if my body isn't tilting the pelvis forwards, what will happen to keep that crease in my hip is I will bend my knee. So just in this position here, you can see that the angle of my leg is not straight anymore. So there's a bend at my hip. And a lot of people who have a naturally very straight back don't realise that they're bending at the knee, so they don't realise that their hip flexors are the problem. They concentrate on the tightness in the hamstring and they're trying to stretch from this position. They can't stretch down here because the hamstrings are very tight. But if you look at your hip flexors, then a lot of the calf tightness, your hamstring tightness will go away just by lengthening out this area. And it's going to help with your performance, because if you're stretching, if your hip is capable of extending, then in running, for example, you're going to get a much higher knee lift just from the elastic recoil from this hip extension, okay? So if my hip extension is very good, then I can extend quite a long way, and that will naturally bring me through into a very high knee lift, because my knee will be driven faster and lift higher as my hip is capable of extending more. If it's not, then what tends to happen is, rather than extending at the hip, which it's not capable of doing, we bend at the knee, which means that you buckle through into your run stride and your knee is pulled short along the ground, okay? So you don't have that high knee lift that you get from the stretch and recoil of your hip flexor. What you get is a bend in the knee, which reduces the power, and then your hip flexor has to work very hard to pull your knee through. Instead, you get a very short run stride and you will probably land with your heel first in this position, rather than being able to extend, bring the knee through and land with your foot underneath you, okay? In terms of swimming, if your hip flexors are very tight, then instead of being straight in the pool, you'll end up swimming a little bit like this, which means that essentially your feet are dragging and increasing the amount of drag in the water, okay? So If your hip flexors are tight, it's going to influence your sporting performance in lots and lots of different ways. It can create different drag in the water, it can reduce the amount of power you can create, and essentially puts your hamstrings and calves, particularly your Achilles, under a lot more strain than it needs to. So the second question that I had asked was from Steve, and he wants to know, what's the simplest hip flexor stretch I know? This is a great question. I love this question. Okay, so if you just put one foot in front of the other in a comfortable position, it doesn't matter how far they are apart, okay? Doesn't matter how far they are that way, doesn't matter how far they are that way, although the wider they are, the easier it will be to balance, okay? Now, because muscle tissue has a spiral in it, has a natural twist through the tissue, the tighter that twist gets, the shorter the muscle gets, okay? So what we're wanting to do is unwind that spiral and lengthen out the tissue, okay? If I just have a static stretch, so if I stand into this position here, push my hip forward and have a static stretch, then that's not going to unwind the tissue, okay? And neither is dynamic stretching, so even just forwards and backwards. It will do it a little bit, but it's not going to unwind that spiral enough for you to have long-lasting change, okay? So what we're going to do is start by going forwards and backwards, just in a nice, comfortable, slow, safe movement, okay? I'm not trying to bounce it like this, and I'm not trying to force it to go further than I want to, okay? I'm not pulling faces at you. I can have a conversation with you. It's just a natural, nice, slow, comfortable rhythm, okay? Then what we want to do, because that's not just how your hip flexors function, we want to take them to a point of stretch, and then we want to make them go sideways. Okay, now this is a direction that your hip flexors work in all the time. But when we think about stretching, we don't tend to look at different ways that the muscles function. We just look at the direction that we want them to lengthen in. But bodies are very, very capable. They're far more capable than we give them credit for. So we tend to limit how much they improve. So the idea of this movement is not that you do it specifically a certain way. The idea is that you just generally move about. So we're going to go around like this now. And you find whereabouts your specific tightness is. So you might find that rotating like this doesn't really do much for your hip. And you might find that being over there is better. And if you turn slightly that way, that might be better. And then you might start to move around like this. So it's not about doing something specific. It's about using the posture to move around and find where your tightnesses are. Because when you find those, that's going to help unlock the problems that you're having. Okay? So let's just do this on the other leg. And again, same thing. As wide as you like, but width equals balance, all right? So if you don't have much balance, then widen your feet. Or if you want to challenge your balance, have them quite narrow, okay? It's entirely up to you. All we're going to do is forwards and backwards. I have my hands on my hips. You don't have to. You could do this cleaning your teeth. You could do it while you're drinking a cup of tea. You could do it while you're on the phone, okay? It doesn't matter when you do this movement, but this is the simplest movement I know and probably the most effective when you start to add in all those movements around, okay? So we're going to go sideways now. So if you're watching this video, what I would like you to do in the comments, okay, is add a comment of where you would do this movement or where you have been doing it. Photos get extra points, videos get extra points, okay? Just comment and let's see how many different places we can recommend or suggest that this movement can be done, okay? So I'm going to go around in a circle like this now, but you can do figure of eight. You can do all sorts, whatever you like. Just keep your legs straight and move your hips, okay? So I hope that helps. And like I said, make sure that you are doing the movements that I'm suggesting, commenting on where you've been doing them, and obviously adding whereabouts you're finding these issues for you, and if it's helping, say how it's helping. Okay? Get your comments in, and don't forget, if you've got any questions, then get them to me, and next week we could be answering your questions. See you then.